Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Mormon Stories Podcast. I'm your host, John DeLynn. It's January 24th, 2020, and we are super excited today to be covering a topic that I know many of you are interested in or care about. Recently, the Salt Lake Tribune came out with an article entitled, "Utah Sees Latter-day Saints Slowdown and Membership Numbers Drop in Salt Lake County." This was a January 5th article that basically talked about how in multiple counties in Utah, Latter-day Saint or Mormon membership is actually either slowing its growth or actually in decline. And then, of course, there's another article called Top 10 Most Encouraging and Discouraging Growth and Missionary Developments for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in 2019, published by Matthew Martinich of Cumorah.com. And so for those of you who have been following Mormon Stories for years, the names Rick Phillips and Ryan Cragun will not be foreign to you. Rick and Ryan are both thoughtful, prominent, in my view, successful sociologists who come from a Mormon background and who occasionally have researched and written about and studied Mormonism. So that's going to be what we're going to be talking about today, why the Mormon Church appears to be either slowing in its growth rates or in decline in Utah and elsewhere. Really quickly, a couple quick announcements. I'll make this super fast. We have a Mormon Stories / Faith Crisis retreat coming up in Salt Lake City at the end of February. The actual dates are February 21st and 22nd. You can go to mormonstories.org/events to register for that. If you or a loved one is having a faith crisis and you need support, these events are really helpful. And then Thrive is coming to Chicago in April 24th through 26th. We have an amazing event scheduled in Chicago. Again, mormonstories.org/events to register for that. Other than that, we're super glad you're joining us. Thanks to everyone who's joining us on Facebook Live. We would love to have your questions and comments there. And without any further ado, let's introduce or reintroduce or welcome back our guests, Rick Phillips and Ryan Cragun. Welcome back to Mormon Stories Podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, John.
Rick, tell us your background really quick.
I am an associate professor of sociology and religious studies at the University of North Florida in Jacksonville, Florida. Jacksonville is where you want to be today. Nice and 70 degrees. I was raised in Utah as a young boy. I grew up in Logan and Cache Valley and then moved to Ogden, went to Weber State, got my master's degree at Utah State, and then went to Rutgers to get my PhD. And there I wrote a dissertation on Mormon congregations and Mormon growth. And I've been teaching the sociology of religion and writing about the sociology of religion and specifically Mormon issues ever since.
All right. Well, welcome back to Mormon Stories. It's great to have you.
Thanks.
All right, Ryan, you're up.
Sure. Rick and I have very similar backgrounds. It's kind of amazing. So I'm a little bit younger than Rick, but I grew up in Morgan, Utah, which when I was growing up, it was 89% LDS, which is fun. And we'll be talking about that, I'm sure. Served a Mormon mission, 96, 98 in Costa Rica, then went to undergrad at the University of Utah, go Utes. Then went to graduate school, University of Cincinnati, to specifically study the sociology of religion. While I was there, I wasn't studying Mormonism. I was told that I shouldn't study Mormonism by my advisor, Reese Williams. But I ended up kind of splitting. So I have two areas of research that I do, which is the non-religious. So I was looking actually during my dissertation at people who leave religion. So that's a big focus of my research. And then the other side is Mormonism. Graduated in 2007 with my PhD, and I've been just down the road from Rick in Tampa, Florida, which is also delightful right now. Since then, and I've been doing research on Mormonism and the non-religious since 2007, basically consistently.
And you got a book, right? You want to plug your book?
I have several. Well, Rick and I have a book together. Rick, do you want to talk about our first book together?
We wrote a book in the run-up to the 2012 election about Mitt Romney.
Could I vote for a Mormon for president?
What was it called? Oh yeah.
Could I vote for a Mormon for president? Yeah.
We are sometime collaborators. Yeah. I'm working on a book on Utah, which I've been writing for a long time. I've been doing field work in Utah consistently throughout my career. Hopefully that will get written soon. Ryan's written a bunch of books on religion and the non-religious, right?
Yeah, the most recent one was an edited volume called Organized Secularism in the U.S., where we were looking at, I mean, it's kind of in the title, organized secular groups, so American Atheists, American Humanist Association, Freedom from Religion Foundation, some of the other groups, and then maybe not just those big kind of national groups, but just organized secularism generally. So lots of places have these groups. Utah has atheist groups and secular groups and free thought groups, humanist groups. So that book was an edited volume where we combined a lot of research on that, it's new. That research is new, so it's kind of fun.
All right. Well, welcome Ryan and welcome Rick. We're super excited to have you, and let's dig in. So as we review this article, Utah sees Latter-day Saints slow down and membership numbers drop in Salt Lake County. It's an interesting article, and I'll just read some of the highlights, and then we'll start here, and maybe we'll discuss some of your theories on why the church seems to be either declining in its growth rates or flat out in decline in Utah. And just to start with this article by Matt Kinham, it says that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints recorded its smallest membership growth in Utah in at least 3 decades this past year. 14 of the state's 29 counties saw the actual number of members decline. So that just out of the gate says that at 14 of 29 counties in Utah, the Mormon Church is in decline. Now, obviously, if other counties like Utah County, are growing by a larger number, maybe that offsets it. And we'll talk about that. I'll just read a couple more of the points. It says the most significant drop came in Salt Lake County, which saw the roster of Latter-day Saints fall by 6,710, even as the state's largest county grew by 10,000 people. So we've got Salt Lake County growing by 10,000 people, but having an actual net decline in Latter-day Saint membership. Those are some interesting thoughts out of the gate. Do either of you want to just start off with the response to those data? Rick, why don't we start with you?
Well, there are a number of things going on. One thing is there's lots of in-migration into Utah, as people who live there know. There are lots of equity migrants from California and other places. Utah has a thriving economy, educated workforce, lots of jobs in Salt Lake. And so a lot of non-Latter-day Saints have been moving in. Utah's, the share of Mormons in Utah peaked around 1990, and it's been a fairly bumpy decline ever since. So there's lots of in-migration. The second thing is birth rates have fallen. Mormon families are still the average Mormon family is still larger than the average American family, but those birth rates have fallen in concert with American birth rates. And I see there was another article that just came out showing that the birth rate in Utah had just fallen below replacement levels. And so Utah's birth rate has fallen rather rapidly. For as long as I can remember, Utah had the highest birth rate among states in the nation, and that's been eclipsed now. South Dakota has the highest birth rate. So Utah has been surpassed. So there is a decline in birth rates, and some of that's starting to show up now with people turning adult age. And of course, there is a lot of resignations, formal resignations, and there are people who just no longer consider themselves Latter-day Saints, who, when they're asked by survey researchers, or they just say we're not LDS anymore. And that's been on the rise. One of the things you see when you look at the general social survey, some of the other data sets that sociologists examine, that this sort of wave of apostasy has been more pronounced in Utah and the Intermountain West. So there's a general secularizing trend in the United States and a movement towards non-religion and people sort of abandoning formal religion. And that trend has been happening within Mormonism as well. But within that trend, there's another trend, which is rapidly accelerating abandonment of religion among Mormons just in Utah and the Intermountain West, over and above the general secularizing trend that we see. So there are some dynamics that are going on in Utah that are exacerbating this secularizing trend. So these three things, migration, birth rates, and disaffiliation, are probably driving what's going on. And you see it in cosmopolitan counties like Salt Lake, which is the epicenter of all of these things.
All right, I love it, Rick. Ryan, do you have an intro kind of response? Anything to add?
Maybe. I actually want to ask Rick a question, if we can kind of make this more of an interactive thing.
Let's do it.
There in sociology, we've long known of this phenomenon called white flight, right? So as minorities move into neighborhoods, white people will move out of those neighborhoods, right? For a variety of, it boils down to racism, but for a variety of reasons boil down to racism. Do you think there's a functional equivalent of Mormon flight, right? That basically, as non-Mormons are moving into, say, Salt Lake County, Mormons, certainly it's not the case outside of Utah that Mormons feel like they have to be with other Mormons because they're often a minority. But in Utah, they have so long been the dominant majority that as they shrink and become a minority, do you think they're actually like, I got to get out of Salt Lake County, and they
do that? Well, they have tried that, but they can't escape. I mean, that's what Eagle Mountain, that's what Eagle Mountain was for. Eagle Mountain is literally a refuge from, the wicked Babylon of Provo. And it was designed specifically for that point. But I mean, the problem is you can't discriminate on the basis of religion for who buys a house. So if you go out in the sticks and you plat a subdivision and you have cheap housing there, you can't stop whoever wants to live there from living there. And cities can do what they can. I mean, Eagle Mountain attempted to implement some rather draconian ordinances and things like that to sort of maintain their family-friendly way of life, or whatever euphemism they use. But there's nothing you can do about it because people move in. So this is the problem. I mean, the Latter-day Saints in the Intermountain West can't sequester themselves. There's, one of the things that I'm looking for that will be an interesting bellwether, and you start to see it beginning now, are Mormon schools. You have the equivalent of Mormon schools they're like parochial schools. Right now, there's lots of homeschooling going on. But when you start to see LDS-only high schools, then you'll know that you're reaching a critical mass. You can't, when I was growing up in Logan, you could go down the street and count off the people that lived on the street, and those were also the people that lived on the ward. I mean, the ward and the neighborhood was tightly consolidated. So a block party was a ward party, de facto. And now that's no longer the case. And so what happens is it's really getting more difficult to sequester young people away from non-LDS playmates. And you might be able to do it in the neighborhood, but it's almost impossible to do at school. When I was 19, if I'm just going to admit my sins here, when I was 19, I didn't really want to go on a mission. I didn't want to go. I remember one of my friends and I sitting on my doorstep saying, yeah, we don't want to go on missions. But there was no thought that we weren't going to go. And the reason why is because at that time I thought, no girl will date me if I don't go on a mission. My brother didn't go on a mission, and I saw sort of the brutal social sanction that he endured. Well, when Salt Lake County is now less than half LDS, my non-LDS friends are going to understand when I say, I don't want to go knock on doors for 2 years. And so there's a place where I can flee to. So you have, I guess maybe you have attempts at Mormon flight, but you also have flight from Mormonism to do, and things that were once normative are now elective, right? So the stigma of not going on a mission is lessened compared to, my generation.
Yeah, I think you're right. So my hometown, I said I was from Morgan. Technically, it's Mountain Green, which is basically kind of between Morgan City proper and Ogden. It's right at the mouth of that canyon right there. And I have a brother who's a real estate agent who basically sells all the homes in that area. Increasingly, it's people from out of state who are buying the homes there. And you're right, like these homes are $800,000. Yeah, they're massive homes. And they're buying them out of state, right? And they're not Mormons moving in. So even if they were trying to sequester themselves, which I kind of get the sense like they want to do that, right? They want to have a community that is not just around the ward, it's literally the community. but they can't because they
Yeah.
can't stop people from moving in. That's clearly happening where I grew up. Like you, we used to be able to go up and down streets and just say, that's a non-Mormon house, the one out of every 20 or
Yeah.
so that was not a Mormon house.
These are the non-Mormon kids in my high school.
And now you can't even do that because it would be every other house is
Right.
a non-Mormon house.
Morgan itself has a way to, I mean, Mountain Green is so close to Ogden that people are, it's essentially a bedroom community for Ogden.
Yep.
Morgan itself has a way to go before it's completely secularized. There are still some holdout places. My brother lives in St. George, and the volume of equity migrants from California that are moving there are rapidly transforming the place. So
are these transplants from California Mormons or never Mormons? Because that's sort of a general perception that over the past couple decades, people get rich in California and then they can't afford to live there anymore, or they want to retire, and so they moved to either Boise or Utah as a way to sort of buy that super large grandparents' house and retire in Alpine or Highland or one of those types of places, right?
Yeah, you also see a thriving tech sector that draws in young professionals. There are all kinds of people moving to Utah that are not Mormon, and they want to go to the store and buy normal beer. They don't want to, and so they pay taxes and they put pressure, saying, "Look, we want to buy normal beer." And the thing about this is it changes the way that Mormons have to think about beer, right? When I lived in Cache Valley, there were two kinds of people. There were people who abstained from alcohol, and there were, alcoholics. I mean, there was the idea that there was some sort of responsible alcohol use would have been preposterous. I mean, I was taught that people who use alcohol are destroying their livers and lives. And now what happens is you have the neighbors move in next door, and they have great careers, and they got wonderfully well-behaved children who do great at school. And when you go over to their house, they have a fully stocked liquor cabinet right there, sitting there for all to see. And you just can't square that with, alcohol is uniformly, people who use it are uniformly wicked. So alcohol becomes not something that, the bad people do. It becomes something that we don't do just for, idiosyncratic theological reasons. And that's more difficult to maintain than just having some sort of blanket stereotype about the evils of the wicked world. So what ends up happening is people with different norms, people with different values sort of encroach on Utah society. The sociologist Peter Berger argued that religion is strongest in places where everybody shares the same faith, because in settings like that, he said that religion is a sacred canopy, and religion sort of integrates everything else. And this canopy sort of keeps things out. When you have religious pluralism, it fractures the canopy and it erodes the salience of religion, because competing claims to exclusive truth cancel each other out. If I say I have the exclusive truth and you say you have the exclusive truth, and we have different exclusive truths, somebody's wrong, or maybe both of us are wrong. And so religion becomes something that is contested, that you have to sort of negotiate with society, rather than something that's just taken for granted, something that just holds you in thrall.
Right. We have to note on that point, right, that phenomenon of breaking down the sacred canopy and the plausibility structures has to happen at the micro level. So just because we have a highly pluralistic U.S. population, you can still get bubbles, right?
Pockets.
Where people have, where they have a very uniform environment, and then their sacred canopy is intact and they're fine. And the argument that we're making right now in Utah is that you don't get those bubbles anymore, right? Like, where can people flee so they're just surrounded by other Mormons? And now you're getting further and further out into the desert, basically, to have that happen. Right?
Or
you can go to Vernal or something.
Right. Or you can, completely withdraw from mainstream to society to the point where you're like Hasidim, you could do it that way too. But Mormons don't want to do that. They want to have their cake and eat it too. They want to participate in mainstream society, but they also want to live in a place where their sacred canopy is intact, and that's no longer possible. I mean, they could retreat into weirdness, or they can just sort of, to the extent that the demography of Utah begins to resemble the demography of the average state, participation in Mormonism in Utah will start to look like the participation of Mormon in an average state. And one of the things we know about super strict religion is that it is easier to convert your friends than it is to retain your children, because people's religious beliefs sort of regress to the mean. If I want ultra strict religion and I marry someone that wants ultra strict religion, the chances are pretty good that my kids won't be as ultra religious as I am. So you see a natural sort of regression to the mean in the next generation. And you see that a lot in the mission field. When I was first doing my field work, I compared a ward in New Jersey, which at that time was 49th in per capita Latter-day Saints, with a Utah ward. And in the Utah ward, you'd see people that were boys that were, 18 and a half years old, that would suddenly straighten up their life and go to avoid the stigma. And people would be like, wow, I can't believe that kid went on a mission. And in New Jersey, you'd have perfectly devout kids that wouldn't go. And people would say, oh, I thought he'd go. And that's the absence, the presence or the absence of the sort of social pressure of a coercive community. And I think that what's happening in Utah is you need a critical mass for that coercive community to be coercive. And that's starting to fray and it's starting to crumble. And when that happens, people who are not aligned with the church because of their subjective religiosity are more inclined to just say, nah, I got better things to do on Sunday. Or no, I'm not paying 10% of my income, for that. So in addition to eroding plausibility, you have changes in the behavioral norms, and then you reach a tipping point.
So I love it. So to Ryan's question, let me read another stat in this Salt Lake Tribune article. It says that Salt Lake County saw its Latter-day Saint membership decline by 6,710. The second biggest drop was in Davis County, where membership decreased by 838. And then to Ryan's question about sort of Orthodox Mormon flight, it says Utah County, home to church-owned Brigham Young University, saw the biggest numerical increase in members at 8,487, followed by Washington County at 2,441. So is there any way to know how much of that's Orthodox Mormon flight within Utah versus, Mormons moving from outside? Is there any way to know?
I don't think so.
Yeah.
I think Utah County is the last, to me, when I think about urban areas that are the last bastion, Utah County is sort of the last bastion. I mean, birth rates are still within the state. Utah used to have the highest birth rate in the state, and Utah County had the highest, or in the nation, and County had the highest birth rate in the state. I think Logan is sort of hanging on, and Utah County are sort of hanging on. So there's still pockets here and there, and still sort of persists. I mean, obviously, when you go to Provo, it has a particular vibe. When you go to Logan, it has a particular vibe. But that's probably going to start to shift. That's probably going to start to change as well, as all of the tech firms that are at the north end of Utah County begin to move south. As the south end of Salt Lake County starts to cost a lot more. I don't know. I mean, you can't hold those bulwarks up forever. What do you think, Brian?
Right. So the other thing that I think Utah County has going for it is, of course, Brigham Young University, right? So Brigham Young, BYU, is still going to attract probably, like the most Orthodox members to go there, right? Because really smart LDS kids who live outside of Utah, they have lots of options. They could go to lots of different universities and do perfectly fine and pay less in some places, right, by going to a big state school and getting a great education. So it still has some draw. It's going to pull in, like Rick was saying, the most Orthodox, the most devout, the most devoted. And if they end up staying, which many of them don't, I don't know what the rate of students who stay in the area after they graduate is, but some of them are going to stay. So they have that going for them as kind of maintaining this pocket, right? Maybe they'll hold out longer. I really don't know. But back to John's question about knowing whether there's clear flight and that's what's actually happening. That's a really tough question. I mean, you'd have to have on the ground data, right? You'd have to be like interviewing people who are, you'd have to actually like be interviewing or surveying people who are moving counties and then asking them exactly why they're doing that. just looking at those numbers, I don't think there's any clear way to definitively say this is Mormon flight or something like that. I don't think we could say that.
I think, wasn't Utah County still around like 80% or something like that? I have to pull this up real quick. I have a note that shows. So, it is pretty much uneven. I know that Davis, Salt Lake, and Weber have changed a lot, but Utah County seems to be holding on. Cache Valley seems to be holding on as well. Morgan County, which is a lot less populous than Rich County, seem to be holding on. So,
do we know why the birth rate amongst Mormons in Utah appears to be in decline? Any idea? Any theories?
Go, Rick.
Well, the birth rate has been declining nationwide generally. And I think the general reason for birth rate declines that sociologists point to is we're shifting from a society where, in agricultural societies, children are an economic benefit. Even an 8-year-old can gather eggs or churn butter. And children, a quiver full of children, make sure that you have someone to take care of you when you're old. And so many of the functions that the family used to serve now have been outsourced to the state. And we live in a society where children are an economic liability. I just saw the tuition that I'm going to have to pay for my kids' high school last week, and I can tell you they're a liability. They cost a fortune. And so to the extent, and even 100 years ago, you worried about whether or not a child was going to survive to adulthood. Now we take for granted that our children will outlive us, and the state takes care of us when we're old. So the function or the nature of families has changed, and as children have become a liability, birth rates have fallen. And I think birth rates have fallen, in the post-war nation precipitously. Yeah. And the Mormon trend has always mirrored the national trend. Mormon birth rates have always looked like American birth rates, except a little higher. The average Mormon family tended to have like one more child per family, but the gap has started to narrow because in childbearing behavior, Mormons have always resembled Americans, but now the resemblance is becoming closer. So you have, I think Jana Reese in the Next Mormon survey showed that a much higher percentage of Mormons that are millennials grew up in families with less than 4 children or 3 children than in our generation. Yeah. So the same kinds of demographic pressures that are exerted on Americans generally have been exerted on Mormons as well.
For those of us who are old enough to remember kind of Mormonism in the 1980s, we remember, prophets like Ezra Taft Benson getting up in General Conference and saying that the woman's place is in the home, that a woman shouldn't work outside the home, that they should have as many kids as possible. And you would think, maybe one would think that the church would never let go of that rhetoric because they want to continue growing. But the truth is, you can't find a lot of statements like that over the past 10 years that I'm aware of, which means that the church, the brethren, have somehow strategically decided that it's not to their advantage or in their belief system anymore to really pressure, women to stay home and have a lot of babies, and to pressure, women to get out of the workforce. Do you guys have any thoughts on that?
It's a losing argument. They're just going to alienate people because that ship has sailed, right? We've known from Tim Heaton's work, and I actually I just finished writing up the draft. Just looking at the proofs for a book chapter on demographics of Mormons in the U.S. Like Rick said, these forces have been playing out for a very long time. I love to use myself as an example. I'm one of 9 kids, right? And one of the things that I would actually add to this is I think shifting economics in Utah, kind of just the forces of production in Utah, we used to have more agriculture in Utah. So I was one of those kids who, starting at 6, I worked in the cherry orchard that my uncle owned, right? I could spend a lot of time talking about, how I was an economic net benefit for my family. But that is absolutely not the case for most kids today in Utah, because who works in agriculture in Utah anymore, right? That number has declined just like it has in the US, to where we're down to under 2% of the US population works in any form of food production or agriculture. So it just doesn't make any sense. So clearly those numbers have shifted. And if the leadership keep pushing this idea that women should work in the home, or women should stay home, work in the home, I like to say work in the home, more than, I'm trying to remember the numbers. It's close to 70% of women, even women with kids who are Mormon, work outside the home. That it's done, right? Like fait accompli, it's not going to reverse itself.
Economic realities.
Yeah, they lost that.
In 2008, Ryan and I analyzed a data set called the ARIS. I don't remember what ARIS stands for.
American Religious Identification Survey.
And what we found is that among Mormons, there are a higher degree of women who are not in the workforce in Utah than there are in the rest of the nation.
Right.
But still, the vast majority, large majority, have to work. I think, there are lots of women, I'm sure, that would, or men that would like to stay home and take care of their kids. But economic realities are what they are.
Yeah, the only real difference that you see these days is Mormon women are more likely to work part-time or work outside of the home, but they're still working, right? I mean, the vast majority of them are working. They're just less likely to be working full-time, but they still have to work for the reason Rick just said. It's just the economic reality that if you want to live a middle-class lifestyle, you got to have two sources of income. You just have to.
One of the things that I've noticed is that having a woman stay at home in Utah now is sort of a marker of status. And it is something that you see, I think, more commonly in the upper middle class than you see, in the working class wards and things like that. And that it is, it still sort of has, I think there still is a legacy of the idea that that's the ideal family form. And so there tends to be a little bit higher status within wards and within neighborhoods of people that can pull it off. Have you noticed that at all?
I think
I guess I'm in Utah more than Ryan.
Yeah, you are in Utah. I was actually going to ask John, because one of the things that I've noticed, I have one kid, Rick has two kids, right? When I'm flying, so I'm through the airport or something like that, and I see a woman toting 4 kids, I kind of, my eyebrows raise, right? I'm like, wow, she's amazing, right? Like, how is she handling 4 kids, right? I'm one of 9. Right. So I have no idea how my parents did it, other than the older kids took care of the younger ones. So I think that's still surprising. But one of the things, I don't spend enough time in Utah to really say this, is a family of 4 kids in Utah unusual at all now? Or is that still like, meh, that's fine. Like, that's not weird. Right. Because clearly in Tampa, in Florida, where I am, you see a woman with 4 kids and you're like, oh, geez, that's a lot of kids to deal with. What's your take, John, Rick? You guys are both there more than I am.
My sense is that amongst Orthodox Mormon families, 4 is very normal.
Yeah, 4 is where you can claim to be doing your job for spirits waiting to come down to earth. Any less than that, and yeah.
Okay.
So this may be obvious to a lot of people, but I just want to ask it anyway. When we talk about people leaving the church, we talk about Jack Mormons, we talk about, let's not talk about the secularization, the broader rise of the nuns kind of secularization trends. We'll talk about that next. But when we talk about sort of apostasy, people resigning, people just falling inactive, this may be an obvious question, but what do you guys see as the drivers for whatever percentage is attributed to that?
For why people leave, why people are leaving the church?
Why Utahns are leaving, church activity, or no longer identifying.
Sure. Rick is always right, I think, in setting the context for this, right? The fact that the sense of community, that everybody is Mormon, is now kind of winnowed down, makes it much easier to leave. And he does a really good job of explaining that. So I should let him. But then I think it's all the same factors that broadly are affecting why people leave religions generally in the U.S.
Yeah, why don't you talk about the national context, and then we'll sort of Mormonize that when you're done.
Sure. So if we go back and just are trying to get a sense of this, back in 1990, it was 7% of the adult population in the US was non-religious. So when you were asked, what is your religion, if any, 7% said, I have no religion. By 2001, it had doubled. So it was 14%. And then the most current data is putting it somewhere between 24 and 26% of the US population says they have no religious affiliation, right? Now, the important part to think about that is obviously not all of those people are non-believers. They're not all atheists. They're not all kind of Richard Dawkins-esque non-believers. But just because religion is multidimensional, it just, sure, 25% are non-religious. Under 30, it's even higher. It's close to 1 in 3. But you can also kind of look at other dimensions, right? So you can ask, well, what percentage believe in God? And that number, depending on how you measure it, can range anywhere from 50 to 70%. And then you have a question like, how many actually go to church? More people will say they go to church than actually go to church. But the numbers that we have suggest that it's only about 1 in 5 Americans are going to religious services on a weekly basis. So we have 25% who say, I have no religious affiliation. Atheists, agnostics, etc., they're now close to anywhere from 30 to 50% of the population. And then the percentage who go to church less than once a week is 80% of the US population. And those numbers, the lower levels of religiosity on all of those dimensions have been going up since the 1990s. Very demonstrably going up since the 1990s.
And some of the main reasons why, what's driving the secularization of America?
Broadly speaking, so the general argument of secularization is that modernization causes this, right? As we become a more modern society, we call it the disenchantment of the world, right? People just don't think about things as being driven by the supernatural anymore, and so the way they think about the world shifts. I think there's a lot more that goes on there, right? So, and kind of the leading theorist on this today, Steve Bruce, would agree that there's a lot more going on. So it's not, and I don't want to simplify it as something like science. It actually includes things like equality, right? And a sense of autonomy. So why should I go to church and listen to a bishop who has less education than I do tell me what I should be doing? Right.
Yeah.
I've got a PhD or I've got a bachelor's degree, and not that the bishop isn't an amazing individual for all his own rights, right? But maybe he's a car salesman, right? Or he sells insurance, and I've read a lot more than he has. Those kinds of factors also contribute to this. And then you get like gender and sexual equality issues. We know that's a big deal for young people in particular, where you have a religion like the LDS Church that continues to hold its position that gay individuals, lesbian individuals, they're not kind of held, viewed the same way. Let's just keep it simple, right? They're not viewed the same way. For young people, that just makes no sense, right?
Yeah.
They've grown up with friends who are gay, and that's fine, right? That's just life. That's the modern world. So holding that antiquated view is going to alienate young people. And then as you politicize things, that alienates young people. So there are many, many factors all kind of loosely tied under that umbrella of modernization is the argument.
Yeah. The other thing is a lot of it is demographic. So you have a rapidly urbanizing population. You have a population with substantial mobility. So you have people moving around and aggregating in cities. I teach in the evangelical South, have many students that are the children of evangelical Christians. And, they get to the point where I like this friend that's a Catholic, or I like this friend that's a Muslim. I just can't bring myself to believe that he's going to be tortured in hell forever. And so to alleviate the cognitive dissonance, you just stop believing in hell. And when you stop believing in hell, that's the first domino. So just I think the general plausibility of religious precepts, not just for advancing science, but also just on the basis of your social dealings with other people and religious pluralism, these explanations of the world just become less plausible. And my students are not atheists, but they have a sort of, God to them is sort of a bellboy in the sky that carries your bags through life. I mean, it's atheological, and they think about spirituality and things like that. But I've noticed, I teach classes on the Bible, and one of the things that I've noticed is that biblical literacy, even among self-professed students, is just absolutely plummeted. I mean, if I ask my evangelical students who are raised in the church, what are the 4 Gospels? I bet half of them wouldn't know.
And the same
So
is true of Catholics. Catholics it's abysmal. So when I'm teaching my social religion class, I'll talk about Catholicism as an example for lots of things. And I'll, like, who are my Catholics in here? And half the class will raise their hands. They have no idea what I'm talking about, right? And I'm
I
not
don't know any of the
Catholic. I'm not even
doctrines.
an expert on Catholicism, right? But they have no idea what it is.
Yeah.
I've heard some social scientists also, and you alluded to this, Ryan, but I just want to tease it out a bit, that there's a cost to conservative republicanism being synonymous with the Christian right. And I know you've already talked about equality as well, but is it true there might be a cost in that association for religiosity more broadly?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know that the data are just like overwhelming slam dunk that when religions align themselves with political parties that they alienate people. We know that it does happen, right? So there's actually some pretty good evidence to suggest this. One study, which actually is kind of interesting, right? American Grace. They actually talk about this, that when you get political from the pulpit, you actually drive people out. And it's not just the people who disagree with the political views, right? It's actually generally across the board, people are just like, that's not why I go to church. I don't go to church for political reasons. Now, that may be changing. That could very well be shifting in some interesting ways. But one of the things that we also do know is when religions align themselves on social issues, they tend to concentrate the people who agree with them in the religion and the other people leave, right? So one of the weird kind of consequences of the LDS Church continuing to hold the line on, say, their position on gays and lesbians is that they're forcing all of the people who are accepting of homosexuality out of the religion, right? So you're actually getting a higher concentration of homophobic individuals in the LDS Church because all the other people are like, why am I going to stay in this religion that is not accepting of these values? So it has this weird kind of effect. And so it's like a chicken and the egg type thing, right? If the religion holds the line, the liberals leave or the conservatives leave, if that were to happen, right? And then it becomes more concentrated. And so you actually get kind of a reiteration of what's going on, and it concentrates those values even more.
So I think one of the reasons why Utah had always been able to resist this trend to a certain degree is because of the sheer density of Mormon ties in the community. So the one interesting thing you have going on in Utah is that there are costs for deviating from the party line outside of church. And so you have a system of surveillance that went on, not a formal system of surveillance, but you have a lot of surveillance that took place in Mormon society that sort of held people who lacked sort of subjective commitments to the church. So, for example, if I want to drink coffee and I'm in the Food King and I grab coffee and put it in my shopping cart, I don't just have to worry about the people in my congregation seeing me. I have to worry about people in my workplace, people in civic organizations, virtually anyone I know. I wouldn't want them to see me with coffee in my shopping cart. And that really didn't exist anywhere else. And that sort of tied people who might otherwise deviate to the church. I remember my dad had the same saying he used to always say when we were kids. On Sunday afternoon, he would always say, I don't know what's the bigger sin, mowing the lawn on Sunday or the fact that I'm not going to mow the lawn on Sunday just because I don't want the neighbors to see me mowing the lawn on Sunday. And so I think a lot of this too is demographic, and as the demographics start to ease, the costs of that deviance declines, and the ability to be surveilled declines, and the consequences of being seen decline. So people are like, yeah, whatever, I'm going to mow my lawn, or I'll go put coffee in a shopping cart,
or freaking go to Costco or skiing, right, or the golf course.
Yeah.
Like I'm really upset. One of the benefits of getting excommunicated was I got to snowboard and golf on Sunday and have the resorts and the golf courses be relatively empty. Others would say the lakes. And one of the things I feel really guilty about and a little bit sad is, to whatever extent I've contributed to apostasy in Utah, I have also contributed to the flooding of people at Costco, golf courses, and ski resorts and lakes.
Oh, yeah.
We have you to blame for that, John.
There we go.
Maybe only a little bit.
The technological. So we've talked about how demography has sort of undercut the coercive community. Technology has been undercutting this longer than people think. So in 1983, the Utah legislature passed something called the Cable Indecency Act, and it was designed to censor HBO so that you couldn't, pipe in movies that show bare-breasted women into living rooms. And they attempted to censor HBO in Utah. So, before 1983, if I wanted to see an R-rated movie, I had to stand in line at a theater, or I risked being seen coming out of the theater. Now, you can do it after that was struck down in federal court. Now you have those movies being piped into your home, so you can enjoy them in the comfort of your own home. And it's the same kind of thing with perusing literature that's critical of the church. You can, in the comfort of your own home, technology will allow you to sort of pick at things that you shouldn't be picking at and learn things that you shouldn't be learning without the fear of being detected. And so one of the things that we've noticed is that if you look at sort of self-reported religious behavior, church attendance or whatever, of the people who have stayed Mormon, church attendance remains uniformly high. Church attendance numbers in terms of a percentage of self-identified Mormons who go to church have stayed the same. So a trend in apostasy in Utah over and above the general secularizing trend are less committed members who have just decided, no, I'm not interested in doing this anymore, and they just stop going. And of course, the more people who do that, the lower the costs.
So you're talking CES letter, you're talking podcasts, you're talking YouTube, all the internet stuff, Google, etc.
Yeah, and I even wonder, and this is something I'd want to ask you guys. I mean, I even wonder the extent to which the anti-Mormon information is just sort of you're allowed to think about it more than you used to. I mean, if you think about anti-Mormon literature, almost all of the anti-Mormon arguments that you see in the CES letter and some of the other things that you see, that stuff was around when I was young. I first encountered anti-Mormon literature my sophomore year in high school as I was walking across the street from Bonneville High to the seminary. There was a guy there handing out pamphlets. And I kept that pamphlet for 40 years because I've always sort of traced my apostasy to that pamphlet. But all of the things, Joseph Smith's polygamy, Adam God, all that stuff I think was relatively well known in my day. And I think people have generally been aware of it. They just haven't indulged in it before. I mean, I think there is a narrative among people who apostatize that the most common way for people to apostatize is to have never heard of these issues before and then suddenly encounter them and then fall away, which of course is Ryan's script. But I think, for the most part, people sort of have issues that bother them, and it allows them to sort of turn to that stuff and say, okay, what's this? One of the things that I've been asking people about who have the sort of standard narrative that I encountered this information that I've never heard before is I'll ask them, like, have you really never heard of that before? You never heard of Joseph Smith's polygamy before? And a lot of them were like, yeah, I heard about it, but I just heard it was, I had always thought it was just an anti-Mormon lie. And then, something gave them the freedom to sort of read a little further.
Yeah, I mean, I've often made the argument that I don't know that it's the intellectual kind of component that is what really drives most people out of religion. I think it's, I go back to the context. Now, granted, I'm a sociologist. I care about context, right? But I think it's shifting contexts that allow people to then ask those questions, right? So Rick mentioned, yeah, I mean, I can give the standard narrative of why I left, that I found stuff that I was like, oh, I had no idea about this. But I did that after I had left Utah, right? I moved to Cincinnati, Ohio. I was surrounded by academics. I was not enmeshed in a network of Mormons, and they were all believing. So I think that general decline of the Mormon community, right, that very specific kind of policing Mormon community, has made it so, one, people can ask those questions. It's safer to do so, and they can actually ask other people. They can find the other person in the ward who's, maybe sitting in the back as well, and they can ask
Reads
those
the
questions.
Tribune.
Yeah, right. They can find those people. So I think that's happening, right? But I think it's the general kind of the whole society has shifted such that like these ideas are pervasive, right? And it's not just the issues with Mormon history or doctrine or anything like that. It's the values, right? So same-sex marriage is legal across the entire United States, right? Like
Yeah.
everybody has to know that. And then you get R-rated movies, right? Like those are getting piped into every home these days. It's pervasive. All sorts of values have shifted, and with the LDS Church not holding those values, it's now hard to maintain that. It's really hard to maintain. Like, nope, we're going to stick here. We're going to stay here when everybody else is shifting.
I also think.
Oh, go ahead.
I also think we should talk about sort of apostasy, apologetics as a source of apostasy. I've always called Mormon apologetics sort of the halfway house of apostasy. And one of the things that I did in response to seeing anti-Mormon literature is went to the apologetic arguments and tried to make sense of the apologetic arguments. And one of the things about apologetics that I think fails for a lot of people is that the apologetic arguments do one of two things. Either, number one, they ask you to accept a difficult explanation for something over a simple explanation for something. And that just, you want me to accept this convoluted explanation of Joseph Smith's polygamy over a perfectly adequate explanation that can be given in one sentence. So that happens a lot. The other thing that happens, I think, is this sort of notion of the incredible shrinking prophets, where, if you have DNA evidence now that shows that the Native Americans are not descended from the Lamanites, then you have to deal with all of these statements from church leaders, from Joseph Smith all the way up to Gordon B. Hinckley, saying that there were. And, when I was a kid, when I was 17, 18, I believed that the veil was so thin between the Lord and his anointed that Spencer W. Kimball essentially sort of walked and talked with God. And I think that was common for people of my age to believe that the prophets are literally in touch with God. And if you want to further the idea that the prophets are inspired and that they receive constant guidance, you have to ask yourself, why wouldn't at some point God say, psst, hey, the Native Americans are not the descendants of the Lamanites, or psst, black people are not the cursed lineage of Cain? Like how did that get left out? So you have, you had Thomas Monson telling Elder Rasband that he received a revelation to call him as an apostle. And I was like, that's great. But somebody should have let Spencer W. Kimball know that when Native American children join the church, they don't turn white. I mean, it just, so I think you have, I will pay 10% of my gross for prophets that are constantly in touch with God. I mean, if prophets are a conduit from to heaven, and they're receiving constant revelation and their guidance is inspired across the board, I'll pay 10% of my gross. But if the prophets are good men who are role models, who live lives worthy of emulation, I'm not going to pay 10% of my gross for that. And so, anti-Mormon literature, apologetics have sort of changed the way that even the average Mormon thinks about his or her religion. And I think the Gospel Topics essays are a classic example of that. They're doing the best they can to put lipstick on the pig, but the problems are still there. You can say that somebody was a few months shy of their 15th birthday. Any literate person knows that means 14.
Yeah, I'll give a couple theories, and then I want to also get some of the comments in. I think number one, the pervasiveness of the information, whether it's through the CES letter, Mormon Think, letter to my wife, all the different websites now, and then all the podcasts, Mormon Stories, Bill Reel, RFM, Year of Polygamy. It's just, I think you could argue, and I've talked to Jehovah's Witnesses and Scientologists, other members of other high demand religions, you could argue that Mormonism per capita leads all high demand religions in terms of their utilization of social media, podcasts, websites, Facebook, etc., even Reddit. They're the largest ex-religious group on Reddit is the ex-Mormon Reddit that's got, if not 150, 200,000 members. So the pervasiveness of the information, I do think there's something, you know how like now that the church can't stop talking about pornography, telling people about it, reminding them about it, forbidding it, we have the highest usage of porn rates of any religion.
Because that's also piped into your home. You don't have to go to an X-rated theater or a dirty video store to get it.
But I think as the church becomes more and more fearful of Mormon Stories podcast, of CES letter, of all these things, the more they talk about it, the more they end up promoting it, which then is sort of this vicious cycle where they're actually accelerating the thing that they fear by demonizing people like me and others that are doing this work. I do think that a huge thing is not just, people like Ryan that move outside of Utah, even within Utah, as groups like Oasis and Thrive and all these Facebook groups and Waka, Women of a Certain Age, and all the Mormon Spectrum communities, now that you can go to a coffee meetup in literally any city in Utah, whether it's Provo or Ogden or wherever, Bountiful, and you can meet in a coffee shop with a bunch of ex-Mormons, find people in your community easily. Again, it makes you a little bit more willing to let go of the rod if you can grab on to an easily accessible community of cool people right nearby. And so the ability to create groups and to affiliate with groups, even in Utah, I think that's a big thing.